Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases ever recorded in rural Pennsylvania. Before we start, please leave a comment telling us where you are and what time it is where you are. We want to know where and when these documented stories are getting out. 3 men came to the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania in the fall of 1920 with a simple job: to clean and fix up a Victorian house that had been empty for 7 decades. What started out as normal work quickly turned into something much worse. The Blackwood Estate, as it is known locally, was at the edge of the Allegheny Forest. Its weathered facade showed that it had been neglected for decades. The house had been empty since 1850, when its original owners mysteriously left, according to county records. Over the years, the deed to the property had changed hands many times, but no one had ever lived there. Finally, a distant heir from Boston had made up their mind to fix up the house and sell it. The Blackwood Estate's architecture wasn't anything special. It was a 3-story Victorian with the usual fancy trim and multiple gabled roofs that were common in rich homes in the mid-1800s. The place was special because of where it was and how it looked. The property was on almost 40 acres of land that bordered the thick Allegheny Forest to the west. It was in a strange state of isolation, even though it was only 3 miles from the Millbrook town center. There were no other homes within half a mile, which was strange for an area that had been growing steadily since the middle of the 1800s. The Millbrook Historical Society's records, which were lost in a courthouse fire in 1965, say that Dr. Elias Blackwood, a doctor who had moved from Boston with his wife, bought the property in 1842. Local tax records showed that Blackwood paid a lot of money for the land and put a lot of money into building the house, which was finished in 1845. The Millbrook Gazette wrote about Blackwood as a gentleman of science and medicine who had a lot of money and was very studious. He seems to have run a small medical practice in town, but most of his time was spent doing research that wasn't specified. People in the area knew about the house by 1920. There weren't any specific legends or ghost stories about the property. Nothing that clear or scary, but people were generally afraid to go near it. Eleanor Crane, who has lived in Millbrook her whole life, told a researcher in 1961, "Nobody ever said, 'Don't go there.' Nobody needed to. You just knew the Blackwood place wasn't somewhere you wanted to be, especially after dark. Animals seemed to stay away from the property too. You'd never see deer or even birds near that house." The renovation crew was led by Robert Davenport, a 2-year-old contractor from Philadelphia. Michael Harrington and Thomas Weiss, both in their mid-30s, were his partners on a number of projects across the state. Millbrook Township records say that the men checked into the local boarding house on the 14th of September 1920 and planned to stay for 3 weeks. Davenport is said to have told Mrs. Eleanor Simmons, the owner of the boarding house, that it was just routine work. All it needs is a good cleaning and some repairs. Architectural firms in Philadelphia strongly suggested Davenport. Records in the State Business Registry showed that Davenport Restorations, his company, had successfully completed dozens of renovations on historic properties in Pennsylvania since it opened in 1912. Before coming to Millbrook, he had just finished restoring a colonial-era home in Lancaster, which got a lot of praise. The Philadelphia Inquirer wrote about him as someone who was very careful, scholarly in his approach to preserving history, and had an almost supernatural ability to figure out how to fix the problems that old buildings present. Michael Harrington was the foreman for Davenport. According to his employment records, he had worked for the company since 1914, except for 2 years during the Great War when he was in the Army Corps of Engineers. His military record said he was praised for being creative in tough situations while serving in France, especially when it came to building underground fortifications. Thomas Weiss, the youngest member of the team, started working for Davenport Restorations in early 1920 after working as an apprentice cabinet maker in Pittsburgh. He was an expert at finishing and working on details. On the morning of September 14th, the men took a train to Millbrook. The station records show that they brought a lot of gear with them, including tools, cleaning supplies, and what the freight manifest called scientific apparatus. Investigators would later pay attention to this last item. When asked about the strange equipment, the station master remembered Davenport saying they were measuring tools for checking the strength of structures. Looking back, This explanation doesn't seem good enough for what witnesses would later say was equipment that was better suited for a medical lab than a construction site. The first week went by without any problems. The men cut back the overgrown plants on the property, fixed broken windows, and started fixing the water damage on the first floor. Several people in the area remembered seeing the three men walk back from the property every night, covered in dust but looking happy. Samuel Keller, who owned the general store where the men bought supplies, said, "They mostly kept to themselves." Davenport said they were making good progress, even ahead of schedule. A receipt from Keller's general store, which is still in the case file, shows that they bought things like lumber, nails, paint, and cleaning supplies, which are all things that are common for renovation work. But starting on September 18, the receipts show more things, like 50 pounds of lime, strange amounts of kerosene, 6 large glass jars with sealing lids, and what was called medical-grade alcohol. Later, when asked, Keller remembered asking Davenport about these purchases. He said they had found some water damage that needed special care to keep mold from growing. That made sense at the time. Mrs. Simmons's boarding house ledger gives us more information about the men's first week in Millbrook. They ate breakfast at 6 in the morning. They left for the Blackwood estate every morning by 7 and usually came back between 6 and 7, 0 inches the evening. They ate dinner together in the dining room of the boarding house and sometimes talked to other guests. Mrs. Simmons remembers that they talked about the presidential election, Harding versus Rhee, Cox, how their work was going, and Davenport's interest in old buildings. There was no mention of strange discoveries or worries about the property in these talks, which is interesting. On Sunday, September 19th, the men didn't work. Instead, they went to morning service at the Millbrook Presbyterian Church. Reverend Howard Miller remembered them as attentive but not very interesting parishioners. That afternoon, Davenport went to the town's small library and asked for information about the Blackwood family and the area's early settlement. Later, the librarian, Miss Margaret Wilson, said she couldn't help much because most historical records were kept in Harrisburg, the county seat. But she did tell him to go see Harold Jenkins, an old man who lives in the town and is thought to be its unofficial historian. Sheriff Hayes talked to Jenkins, who was 87 at the time, after the events at the estate. Deputy Morgan wrote down what he said, which shows that Davenport came to his house on Sunday afternoon with specific questions about Dr. Elias Blackwood. He wanted to know about the doctor's research, his reputation in town, and especially why he left so suddenly in 1850. Jenkins said, "I told him what little I knew, that Blackwood had been respected, but somewhat reclusive, that rumors suggested he conducted unusual experiments, and that his departure had indeed been abrupt and unexplained." Jenkins also told Davenport about a local legend that, in the months before Blackwood's departure, several townspeople had reported hearing strange sounds coming from the estate, described as mechanical grinding and an odd humming, like machinery but somehow organic. Most importantly, Jenkins told a rumor that had been going around in the years after Blackwood went missing. It said that the doctor had been building some kind of underground facility under his house. Jenkins says that Davenport was especially interested in this last detail and asked a lot of follow-up questions about the supposed underground structure, such as how big it might be, what it might be used for, and if anyone had looked into it after Blackwood left. Jenkins couldn't say much because the rumors had never been proven true, and the property had stayed empty. He did say, though, that a group of local boys who broke into the house as a dare in the 1882nd said they found a bricked-up door in the cellar with strange markings on the bricks. Jenkins ended his story to Sheriff Hayes by saying that Davenport had seemed too interested in these old stories, more than seemed natural for a man hired simply to restore the place. The sheriff asked if he had told anyone else about these worries at the time. Jenkins said he hadn't. "Mr. Hayes, at my age, you learn to mind your own business. Who was I to question a professional man about his interests? But I will say this. When I pointed out those markings on the bricks, there was something in his eyes, not surprise, you understand. Recognition." The Millbrook Sheriff's Department would later do a lot of research into what happened in the second week, but the case files would be put away in 1952 and never opened again. Mrs. Simmons's written account says that the men's behavior changed a lot around the 10th day. Her statement said, "They stopped eating together in the dining room. Mr. Davenport asked for meals to be brought to their rooms. Mr. Harrington got a cough that wouldn't go away, which kept the other boarders up at night, and Mr. Weiss stopped talking altogether. In her statement, Mrs. Simmons said that the change seemed to happen right after they got home from work on Thursday, September 23rd. They came back later than usual, after 8, and they weren't together. Mr. Harrington was the first to arrive, alone, and went straight to his room without talking to anyone. His clothes were unusually dirty, not with the usual dust from construction work, but with dark soil, as if he'd been digging. About 30 minutes later, Mr. Davenport and Mr. Weiss arrived together. They were talking quietly in the foyer, until they saw me, and then they stopped. James Crawford, a traveling salesman who was staying at the house that week, was another boarder who gave more information. His statement said, "I was smoking on the porch when Harrington came up the walk. The man looked terrible. He was pale and sweating even though it was cool outside. I called out to him, but he walked past me as if he didn't hear me. Later, when the other two arrived, I overheard parts of their conversation. Davenport seemed to be giving orders. The phrases I caught were, 'Keep it contained, and we'll need special equipment.' When they saw me, Davenport nodded politely, but Weiss, I'll never forget, his face was terrified." The men's behavior got stranger and stranger on Friday, September 24. Instead of leaving together at their usual early hour, they left one at a time. Davenport left first, at 6:30 a.m., and Weiss left an hour later. Harrington didn't leave his room until almost noon. Mrs. Simmons said she heard him pacing around all morning. When he finally came out, he asked for coffee but not food. She said he looked sick and pale, as if he had a fever. When she told him he might need a doctor, he laughed in a way that made her uncomfortable and said, "No doctor can help with this, ma'am." Davenport asked for two strange things later that day. First, he asked Mrs. Simmons if there was a telegraph office in town. When she said there wasn't, he paid Timothy Rogers, a local boy, to take a message to the Harrisburg office. No one ever found out what this telegraph said, because the records were destroyed every 6 months. His second request was to borrow Mrs. Simmons's copy of the King James Bible, which she kept in the parlor of the boarding house. She remembered that he seemed upset when he asked for this, and that he specifically wanted to know if it was a complete text with all the extra parts. The men left for work on September 25th, as usual, but came back at different times, hours later. Mrs. Simmons said that Davenport came first, around 30 inches the afternoon. His clothes were cleaner than they had been in the past. He went straight to his room without saying hello to anyone. Harrington came back at dusk and looked confused, according to reports. Witnesses say that he kept asking Mrs. Simmons what day it was. Weiss didn't come back until long after midnight. Jonathan Pierce, the night clerk, said he looked deathly pale and that he didn't seem to have his work boots on. Pierce's full statement gives more disturbing information. He told Sheriff Hayes, "I almost didn't recognize Mr. Weiss when he came in. At first, I thought he looked sick, like a lot of men do after a night of drinking, but it was how he moved. He walked stiffly and mechanically, as if each step required conscious thought. When I asked if he was okay, he stared at me for almost a full minute before answering. He said, 'I am here. I am still here.' Then he went up the stairs, leaving muddy footprints. I noticed then that he was in his stocking feet." Davenport was the only one who showed up for breakfast the next morning. He is said to have said that his coworkers were sick and would stay in their rooms when asked about them. He left for the Blackwood estate by himself. Mrs. Simmons was worried about Harrington's cough getting worse, so she tried to check on him around noon, but he didn't answer when she knocked. Weiss also didn't answer his door when someone offered to bring him food. Several people said they saw Davenport in town that morning instead of at the estate. Albert Mason, the town's pharmacist, said that Davenport came to his store shortly after 9:00 and asked for the strongest sedatives and tincture of iodine. When Mason told him that these drugs needed a doctor's prescription, Davenport became insistent, saying it was a matter of public safety. Mason said no to the request and told Davenport to call Dr. Wilson if there was a medical emergency. Mason said that Davenport then asked a strange question. Is there any substance known to render a person unconscious that cannot be detected afterward? At this point, Mason said he got scared and told Davenport to leave the pharmacy. Davenport did what he was told, but he was seen soon after at Wilson's Mercantile, where he bought a bottle of chloroform, supposedly for cleaning delicate architectural features. At the time, there were no rules about such purchases, but store owner Theodore Wilson thought the request was strange enough to tell others about it, which is how investigators found out about it. Davenport got back that day earlier than usual, around 1 p.m. Several people say that he asked for a ride to the train station in Harrisburg, a town about 20 miles away. He only took a small leather bag with him and left most of his things behind. When Mrs. Simmons asked about the other men and their things, Davenport reportedly told her they would sort themselves out and then left, giving her a month's worth of rent. This was the last time anyone saw Robert Davenport for sure. Howard Miller, who ran the only car service in town, took Davenport to Harrisburg. Miller said in his statement that Davenport seemed unusually upset during the trip. Miller said, "He kept looking back over his shoulder, as if he thought someone was following us. About halfway to Harrisburg, he told me to stop the car. He got out and walked to the edge of the forest that bordered the road. He stood there for a few minutes, staring into the trees. When he got back in the car, he was shaking. He asked me how far the Allegheny Forest went and if there were any caves or other strange geological features in the area." Miller also said that as they got closer to Harrisburg, Davenport asked not to be taken to the train station as they had planned, but instead to the Western Union Telegraph office. Davenport went inside while Miller stayed in the car. Davenport asked to be taken to a hotel instead of the station when he got back about 15 minutes later. Miller did what he was told and dropped him off at the Harrisburg Grand Hotel around 4:00 inches the afternoon. Records from the hotel show that a man who said he was Robert Davenport checked in that day, but left unexpectedly at 11 p.m. that same night. He left behind a paid bill, but no luggage. Mrs. Simmons called Sheriff William Hayes that night because she was worried about the sudden departure and the fact that the other rooms were still quiet. When the police broke into the rooms, they found them empty. The men's things, including their wallets with ID, were still there. Sheriff Hayes wrote in his report that both beds looked like they hadn't been slept in, as if they hadn't been used. There was a handkerchief on the floor that belonged to Harrington. It had what looked like dirt on it instead of the usual signs of illness. Deputy Morgan's extra report gives more information about how the rooms are. There was a notebook in Harrington's room that had what looked like technical drawings and measurements in it. These included detailed drawings of underground chambers with labels like primary containment area and secondary barrier system. The last page had a hastily written note that said, "Structural integrity compromised. Estimated 3 to 5 days before complete failure. RD refuses to acknowledge the implications." Investigators found Weiss's clothes neatly laid out on the bed, including socks and underwear, which suggested he had changed his clothes completely before leaving. It was even more disturbing to find his boots in the closet, with their soles covered in a sticky black substance that wasn't normal mud. Dr. Wilson's chemical analysis showed that the substance had organic compounds that were consistent with decomposition products and small amounts of an unknown metallic element. The most confusing thing was a series of marks carved into the wooden floor below the room's only window. These marks looked a lot like symbols that were later found in the Blackwood Estate's cellar. Sheriff Hayes put together a search party to look into the Blackwood Estate the next morning after 2 men went missing and 1 ran away. The official report used sparse clinical language to describe what they found there, but the Millbrook Gazette's interviews with search party members in October 1920 gave a much clearer picture. Sheriff Hayes, Deputy Morgan, Dr. Wilson, and 3 local men who were good at hunting and knew the area well made up the search party. They got to the Blackwood Estate not long after dawn on September 27th. Deputy Morgan's report says that the first thing they noticed was how quiet it was around the property. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, and none of the normal sounds that come from the edge of the forest. Dr. Wilson called the area around the house acoustic dead zone because it was quiet for about 200 yards in all directions. The house itself looked like it was being partially renovated. There were tools all over the first floor, and it was clear that some work was going on. A section of water-damaged floorboards in the main parlor that had been partially removed showed the way to a cellar that had never been documented before. Frank Morgan, the deputy sheriff, said that the entrance was strange. It wasn't a normal cellar door or hatch. It was a tunnel that was angled in a strange way and looked like it had been sealed with bricks and mortar at some point and then opened again recently. There is more information in Dr. Wilson's separate statement. The hole was about 3 feet wide and lined with bricks that were denser and darker than regular clay bricks. The mortar between the bricks had been carefully removed, and the bricks were stacked neatly next to the hole. The work looked planned, not like it was done quickly. The most interesting thing about the bricks was the markings on them, which were symbols carved or pressed into the bricks during manufacturing, not added later. They didn't look like any alphabetic or numerical system I know. Sheriff Hayes first told Deputy Morgan to stay on the first floor while he and Dr. Wilson looked into the entrance to the cellar. But in the end, all 3 men went down, leaving the other search party members to look at the house's upper floors. Hayes's report says they used lanterns to light up what turned out to be a steeply sloping tunnel that went under the house's foundation instead of a regular cellar. The search party went down into the cellar, which was much bigger than the house's foundation. Sheriff Hayes's report said that the underground area had 3 chambers that were connected by narrow passages. The walls were strange. Instead of the usual stone foundation, they were made of carefully worked masonry, with strange symbols carved at random intervals. Later, Professor Walter Hammond of Miskatonic University, who went to the site in 1932, looked at the markings again and said they looked like some old European runic alphabets, but it was still not clear what they meant. The first room, which was about 20 feet below ground level, looked like it was a living space. There was a cot, a small table with a kerosene lamp, and shelves with scientific tools like microscopes, glass slides, and specimen jars. There was a journal on the table with Harrington's handwriting in it. The most recent entry was from September 24th. Hayes's report quotes this entry: Day 9 of excavation.
We have cleared the passage to the second chamber and partially removed the blocking wall to the third. D believes we are close to the primary containment area. The air quality deteriorates as we progress deeper.
W has begun exhibiting unusual symptoms, auditory hallucinations, and periods of dissociation. D dismisses these as the effects of poor ventilation, but I am not convinced. There were signs that the narrow passage to the second chamber had recently been widened, as there was freshly dug soil piled up along its length. Deputy Morgan said in his report that the temperature dropped a lot more than would be expected just from going deeper underground. Dr. Wilson noted that the temperature was 42 degrees, which was very cold for the time of year and depth. The search party found signs of recent activity in the second chamber. There were tools from the renovation crew arranged in a circle around a part of the floor that had been dug up. Deputy Morgan said that there was a hole that was about 3 feet deep, and the dirt was neatly piled to one side. At the bottom, there was a flat stone slab that looked like it had been partially raised and then let go back down. This stone slab, which was about 6 feet wide and 8 inches thick, had writing on it that was similar to the writing on the brick walls, but more detailed and longer. Dr. Wilson's examination showed that the slab was not local stone, but a type of dense black basalt that does not naturally occur in Pennsylvania. The 8 metal rings that were set into the edge of the object were even more confusing. Each one had a different symbol on it. Tool marks showed that someone had recently tried to lift the slab with these rings. The worst part was how bad the soil around the slab was. Sheriff Hayes's report says it was unusually dark and moist, with an oily quality and a smell like organic decay. Dr. Wilson took samples to analyze, but the sheriff's office never made his results public a week later. Deputy Morgan, who saw the analysis, said that the soil had microscopic structures that didn't fit with any known geological or biological classification. It wasn't a mineral, plant, or animal, but it had traits of all 3. A wall that had been blocking the way to the third chamber had just been taken down, and the stones that had been used to build it were carefully stacked along one side. This passage, unlike the others, looked like it had been sealed on purpose. Instead of bricks and mortar, It was sealed with fitted stone blocks held together by an unknown dark substance that Dr. Wilson called resinous but inorganic. Later tests would suggest that it had elements that were not known to be in the periodic table at the time. The third chamber had the most upsetting results. Several people have said that the room had a table made of rough-hewn wood on which were a leather-bound journal from 1847 to 1850, a set of strange surgical tools that looked very old, and 3 glass jars that seemed to contain preserved organic material. Sheriff Hayes called them anatomical specimens of undetermined origin, but Deputy Morgan told the Millbrook Gazette more directly that they were organs, human or otherwise, suspended in some kind of solution. A closer look at the chamber showed that there were a number of diagrams drawn with charcoal directly on the stone walls. These were pictures of anatomical studies of an organism that didn't look like any known species. Dr. Wilson's notes, which are part of the case file, say that the drawings show a central mass with radiating extensions, neither vertebrate nor invertebrate in structure, possessing characteristics that defy biological classification. Next to these diagrams were more of the strange symbols, arranged in patterns that look like some kind of systematic notation. The most important thing is that investigators found Thomas Weiss in this third room. He was alive, but completely unresponsive, as he sat up in a corner. Dr. James Wilson, the medical examiner who was called to the scene, said that Weiss had no visible injuries but was in a profound catatonic state, unlike any I have encountered in my medical practice. Weiss was taken to Harrisburg State Hospital, where he would stay until he died in 1953 without ever speaking again. 3 days after Weiss was admitted to the hospital, Dr. Wilson's medical report gave even more disturbing information. The patient does not respond to outside stimuli. Pain, light, and sound do not seem to register. Pupillary reflexes are present, but slow. The heart rate and breathing are abnormally slow. The body temperature is always below normal, at about 95 degrees F. The most unusual thing is the periodic movement that happens mostly at night. The patient's right hand repeatedly traces patterns in the air that match the symbols found at the Blackwood estate. These movements happen with mechanical precision every 37 minutes. The property did not have Michael Harrington on it. Mrs. Simmons found one of his work boots at the edge of the property, where the landscaped grounds met the forest. There was no more proof of his whereabouts found in the nearby woods. He was officially declared missing, and even though searches were done every few months for the next 2 years, they never found him. Investigators were especially interested in the boot itself. Dr. Wilson's exam showed that the leather had broken down in a strange way, becoming brittle and changing color in a pattern that started at the sole and moved up. The same black substance was also found on Weiss's boots, mostly around the eyelets and laces, which was more worrisome. It was most puzzling to find that the iron nails holding the sole of the boot to the upper had changed into another metal that later tests said was similar to, but not the same as, silver. Sheriff Hayes talked to people in Millbrook who had seen the 3 men after the discovery at the Blackwood estate. A pattern started to form, which made it seem like Davenport had more than just renovations on his mind when he came to Millbrook. Timothy Rogers, the boy who took Davenport's telegram to Harrisburg, remembered that Davenport had asked him a lot of questions about local stories about the Blackwood estate while they were on their way. Rogers said he seemed especially interested in whether anyone had ever gone missing near the property. He asked me if I had ever heard strange noises coming from that direction, especially at night. When I told him that my grandfather had once mentioned a low humming sound, he got very excited and offered me an extra $1 to remember any other details. The journal found in the third room became very interesting. Sheriff Hayes's report says that it had Dr. Elias Blackwood's personal writings in it. He was the first person to own the house. The whole journal was never made public, but parts of it were published in Professor Hammond's 1936 book, Architectural Anomalies in Early Pennsylvania Estates, which was published by Miskatonic University Press. Hammond says that Dr. Blackwood called himself a natural philosopher who was interested in the line between living and dead things. The journal described experiments done in the chambers under the house. At first, they were about how to preserve organic matter, but over time they moved on to more abstract topics. In later entries, Blackwood talked about entities that exist in the spaces between conventional matter and the permeable nature of perceived reality. Hammond's monograph quotes one particularly disturbing passage from April 1849. Success, at last. The barrier has been breached, though in a limited fashion. That which exists beyond responds to specific frequencies of sound and light. Communication is challenging, but not impossible. They perceive time differently. What we experience as moments, they experience as a continuous flow without division. Most significant is their relationship to organic matter. When exposed to living tissue, they display behavior analogous to curiosity, though this anthropomorphic interpretation may be wholly inadequate. A later entry from June 1849 says, "So far the containment measures have worked, but I can see that the materials are slowly breaking down. The entities, if that term even applies, have an effect on physical matter that is like erosion but works in a different way. Metal objects near the containment area change at the molecular level in ways that don't follow known chemical processes. Organic materials break down faster and then reconstitute in new ways. This could have big effects on medical science if the process can be controlled." The last dated entry from April 1850 said, "It is too late. What we have invited cannot be uninvited. I have sealed the chambers as best I can, but this is merely postponement, not resolution. May whoever reads these words understand that some doors, once opened, cannot truly be closed again." After the discovery, there was a lot of talk in the area about the Blackwood estate. In October 1920, Sheriff Hayes told the workers to seal the cellar chambers with concrete. The house itself was still empty, and the renovation was stopped. In 1925, a fire that could not be traced destroyed most of the building, leaving only the stone foundation and part of a brick wall. According to county records, the township bought the land in 1937 and said it was not suitable for development. Several people who lived nearby saw the fire during a strong thunderstorm on the night of the 14th of June 1925. The Millbrook Gazette got their stories, which talk about strange things about the fire. Martin Reynolds, who lived on the nearest farm to the estate, said that the flames were wrong too white, almost blue in places, and they moved against the wind. Eliza Thornton, who saw the fire from her home about a mile away, said, "There was no smoke, just those terrible flames, and no sound either, even though the fire was so big. It was as if the house was being consumed in silence." Fire Chief Edward Simmons, who is not related to the owner of the boarding house, was in charge of the response. Even though his team got there too late to save the building, his official report says that the fire acted differently than most structure fires, focusing mostly on the area above and around the cellar entrance. The heat in this area was strong enough to melt parts of the foundation stones, which is much hotter than what you would expect in a house fire. He also said that even though it was raining and the team was working hard, the fire seemed to resist water, almost as if it was repelled by it. After the fire, the area around the old Blackwood estate became known for strange things that happened. Hunters and hikers said they got lost when they were near the property, and some experienced woodsmen got lost for no reason, even though the weather was clear and the terrain was familiar. In 1928, a geological survey team from the University of Pennsylvania said that their tools stopped working when they were within half a mile of the old house site. This was especially true for magnetic compasses and early electronic measuring devices. No one knew where Robert Davenport went after he left Millbrook until 1927, when a man who looked like him was admitted to a sanatorium in western Massachusetts under the name Richard Daniels. The attending physician's notes, which were found after the facility closed in 1962, said that the patient had persistent delusions regarding subterranean spaces and entities residing therein. The patient is said to have died of pneumonia in 1929. The medical file, which is now in the archives of Miskatonic University's Department of Abnormal Psychology, has transcripts of interviews with the patient when he was lucid. In one interview from March 1928, Daniels talked about his time in Millbrook in a fragmented but disturbing way. The old fool thought he could keep them inside with stone and mortar, symbols, and geometries, but they don't see barriers the way we do. To them, solid matter is just dense probability, and probability can be changed. When asked about his coworkers, the patient reportedly got upset and said, Harrington was taken first. He made the mistake of touching the surface directly, without protection. I saw it begin at his fingertips, a kind of shimmering, as if his flesh was becoming uncertain of itself. By the next day, it had reached his mind. We lasted longer, but he looked too deeply into the space beneath the stone. He's still there physically, but his consciousness, who they took that elsewhere. The patient's description of what was under the stone slab in the second chamber was the most disturbing. Not a thing, exactly. More like an absence that thinks. A negative space, with agency and awareness. Blackwood thought he was studying it, but it was studying him. Studying us all. Learning. Adapting. Preparing. When asked to explain, the patient reportedly smiled and said, They're patient. They measure time in geological epochs, not human lifespans. What's a century or two of waiting to entities that existed before the Earth cooled? Professor Hammond did the only official academic investigation into the event in 1932. He spent 3 weeks in Millbrook going over records and talking to witnesses. He had to stop his research when he got what he called a persistent nervous condition that made him go back to Arkham. His monograph, which came out 4 years later, mostly talked about the Blackwood estate as an architectural oddity and only hinted at what happened in 1920. But Hammond's private letters tell a different story. In letters to coworkers at Miskatonic University, he talked about hearing strange sounds while looking at the old estate grounds. A barely perceptible humming at the lower threshold of human hearing, along with a sense of presence that can't be explained by any visible entity, in a very open letter to Dr. Armitage, the university's head librarian. Hammond wrote, I am increasingly convinced that what Blackwood discovered and what Davenport subsequently encountered represents not merely an unknown biological phenomenon, but a fundamental challenge to our understanding of reality itself. The boundaries we perceive between matter and energy, between organic and inorganic, may be merely artifacts of our limited perceptual apparatus, conventions rather than absolute truths. The last official record of the event is in Millbrook Township records from 1952. Which say that Sheriff Hayes's case files were moved to deep storage as part of a general archiving process. A note from the office said that the files were missing some things, including some pictures and the original copy of Dr. Blackwood's journal. There is still a lot of speculation about what happened in the chambers under the Blackwood estate. In a 1955 interview, Deputy Morgan, who was then old and retired, gave perhaps the most disturbing view. We never found out what those men found under that stone slab in the second chamber.
But whatever it was, I believe it followed them out. When asked for more information, Morgan described what happened after the incident. After we sealed those chambers, strange things happened in Millbrook for months. People reported strange sounds at night, not loud, but persistent, like machinery operating deep underground. Dogs refused to walk on certain streets. There were also electrical problems. Lights flickering for no reason, phones ringing with no one on the line. What really stood out was what happened to the concrete we used to seal the entrance. Every few weeks, cracks would appear in the same pattern, like the ones on the walls of the chamber. We would fix it, and then new cracks would show up days later. It was like something was testing the barrier, slowly and carefully. Morgan also said that Sheriff Hayes had been keeping an unofficial eye on the property for years after the official investigation was over. Morgan said, what he saw down there changed Bill. He never talked about it openly, but he went to the site at least once a month until he died in 1939. He kept a private journal of what he saw, which his widow burned at his request. But one time, after a few drinks, he told me he thought the chambers were a door that swings both ways. When I asked him what he meant, he said only that doors can be approached from either side. In 1963, while building the interstate highway system, workers clearing land near the old Blackwood property found a series of underground passages that were not shown on any utility or geological survey.
The project foreman's report said that the passages were long and built for a specific purpose, and they went toward the Allegheny Forest. It was decided that the find was a safety risk, so the passages were filled with concrete before any real investigation could be done. Charles Miller, one of the workers who was there when the discovery was made, talked about it in a local newspaper interview years later. Those tunnels weren't like normal mine shafts or utility tunnels. He said, "The walls were lined with some kind of dark stone that had been polished smooth. The temperature was what struck me the most. It was July, and it was very hot above ground, but down there it was cold enough to see your breath, and the air tasted heavy and metallic. None of us wanted to stay down there any longer than we had to." Miller talked about finding strange things in the tunnels. There were these metal discs embedded in the walls at regular intervals, about the size of dinner plates, covered with markings similar to what you'd see on an astrolabe or some old navigational instrument. They seemed to vibrate slightly when approached, though that might have been a trick of the light. The foreman ordered us not to touch anything, and we were happy to comply. The whole place felt wrong somehow. Miller's description of what they found at the end of the main tunnel was the most disturbing. We came to a circular chamber with a raised platform in the center. On this platform was what looked like scientific equipment, glass tubes, metal frameworks, things that reminded me of the inside of a radio, but more complex. Everything was covered in a fine black dust. When our lights hit this dust, it seemed to move of its own accord, forming momentary patterns before settling again. The foreman took one look and ordered everyone out. The next day, government types showed up, and we were all reassigned to different sections of the highway project. In the years that followed, the town of Millbrook itself went through a lot of changes. The economic boom after World War II mostly missed the area, and the population kept going down. When Caroline Russell, a geography professor, tried to find the Blackwood Estate in 1968 for a study on local folklore, she discovered that the property lines had been changed, and a lot of the original land had been turned into a state forest preserve. Russell wrote in her field notes, "The most striking thing is how thoroughly the local memory has been effaced. Residents under 50 years of age have no knowledge of the Blackwood Estate or the events of 1920. Older residents change the subject when it's mentioned. It's as if the community has collectively decided to forget." Russell's research uncovered a curious demographic anomaly. Millbrook had experienced an unusually high rate of outward migration in the years following 1920, with nearly 30% of the population relocating within a decade, far above the regional average for similar rural communities. The pattern of this migration was more telling. Instead of moving to nearby industrial centers for work, people from Millbrook moved all over the country, with no clear pattern except that they moved far away from their old home. Russell talked to former residents, and one thing that came up a lot was that many of them left Millbrook because of health problems, especially trouble sleeping and a general feeling of unease. Russell heard Marion Thompson say, "It wasn't anything you could point to specifically, just a feeling that something wasn't right. Sounds you'd hear at night that couldn't be explained. The way animals behaved, nervous, skittish." When 3 people at church mentioned it on the same Sunday, my husband decided it was time to leave. The most disturbing thing about the story may come from an unexpected source. In 1967, while cataloging artifacts in the Emskatonic University archives after Professor Hammond died, a research assistant found a sealed envelope that looked like it held a single page torn from a journal. The handwriting looked like Dr. Blackwood's, but there was no date on the page. The text said, "They are patient. They don't think in terms of years, but of centuries. They wait in the spaces between moments and the shadows between thoughts. They are not evil, because evil is a human trait. They just are, and once invited, they stay, first as observers, then as participants." This part, which was apparently missed when the original journal was lost or taken out of the sheriff's files, came with a hand-drawn diagram showing concentric circles with the symbols found in the underground chambers arranged in certain ways. There were notes in the margins that were hard to read because of water damage. They talked about resonance frequencies and perception thresholds. The most interesting thing was a note at the bottom of the page that said, If my calculations are correct, the barrier will need to be renewed in 75 years. May whoever reads this understand the necessity. Professor Russell's later research showed how important this 75-year gap was. In 1925, the year the Blackwood House burned down in an unusual fire, it would have been 75 years since Blackwood sealed the chambers in 1850. If the pattern continued, the next important date would be 2000. But what might happen then is still up in the air. Thomas Weiss was the only member of the renovation crew who could be found at the Blackwood estate. He stayed at Harrisburg State Hospital in his unresponsive state for decades. As time went on, his medical records showed that he was moved to facilities that were farther and farther away. Eventually, he lived at Greylock Sanatorium in western Massachusetts, which was not far from where Davenport was later put in a mental hospital under a false name. Dr. Elizabeth Parker was Weiss's doctor from 1947 until his death in 1953, and she kept detailed records of his health. The patient shows no signs of getting worse, even though he can't move. She wrote in 1950, "Muscle tone stays normal even without exercise. Metabolic processes slow down a lot. He only needs to eat every 3 days." The most amazing thing is that his condition has stayed the same. He hasn't aged visibly in the 30 years since he was admitted. Parker also wrote about the strange things that happened around Weiss. Things in his room often move around on their own. When he's around, electronic devices don't work right. The most troubling thing is how it affects other patients who live nearby. They all have the same dreams of underground spaces and unseen presences. 3 orderlies who worked with patient W regularly have quit after saying they were missing time and couldn't remember hours of their shifts. Weiss's death, on the 17th of April 1953, was just as mysterious as his life had been for the last 30 years. Dr. Parker's last report said that he ceased all biological functions simultaneously at precisely 3:47 a.m. The circumstances of his death were very strange. All the clocks in the facility reportedly stopped at that exact moment, and several patients and staff members said they heard a low humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. State officials kept the autopsy results secret, but rumors in the medical community said that there were strange things that couldn't be explained. In a private letter, a nurse who helped with the procedure later said that Weiss's internal organs showed no signs of damage, even though he had been immobile for years. She also said that some structures were present that did not match any known human anatomy. The land where the Blackwood estate used to be is still empty today. Hikers in the Allegheny Forest sometimes say they feel strange cold spots and get lost when they are near the area. However, official Forest Service maps now show that all trails are at least a mile away from the area. A geological survey from 1957 found strange readings that were consistent with large underground spaces, but no more research was done. A group from the U.S. went to, as part of a larger research project, the Geological Survey did magnetotelluric studies in the area. Their results, which were published in a little-known scientific journal, showed that there was a magnetic anomaly that stayed in the same place on the old Blackwood property. The report called this anomaly a spherical region about 200 yards in diameter, within which magnetic compasses showed deviations of up to 45 degrees from true north. More advanced tools can pick up changes in the local magnetic field that happen every 37 minutes, which is exactly the same amount of time that Weiss's hand movements were seen decades ago. The report's authors said that these results were caused by strange mineral deposits or possible concentrations of ferromagnetic ore. They also said that no known geological formation could cause effects with such precise periodicity. A proposed follow-up study utilizing more advanced equipment did not come to fruition. The funding was inexplicably diverted to alternative projects. Margaret Collins, a graduate student in folklore at the University of Pittsburgh, came to Millbrook in 1965 to study local legends for her dissertation. Her interviews with older people who lived in the area showed that something strange was happening. The details of the 1920 event had faded from people's minds, but a new story had spread among the younger generation. Kids in Millbrook told stories about the humming in the forest, which was a place where you could hear a sound like a machine running underground if you stood very still and listened closely. Parents thought these stories were just kids' imaginations, not knowing how eerily similar they were to real events in the past. Collins also wrote down what people in the area thought about a phenomenon called forest time, which is when watches run at different speeds in certain parts of the woods near the old Blackwood property. Hikers said they looked at their watches and saw that hours had gone by when it felt like only minutes had passed, or that only minutes had gone by when it felt like hours had gone by. People always blame these strange time changes on confusion or broken clocks, but the fact that they happened consistently and in certain places made them seem even stranger. In the winter of 1969, an old man checked into the same boarding house where Davenport, Harrington, and Weiss had stayed almost 50 years before. The owner said that the man asked specifically about the Blackwood estate and seemed upset to find out that the house had been destroyed. He walked around the area of the old property for a few days, even though the weather was bad. He left an envelope with a key that was shaped in a strange way and a note that said, "It still waits below." The owner, Martha Wilson, who is Mrs. Simmons's granddaughter, said the visitor looked scholarly and spoke with a Boston accent. She thought he was about 70 years old. He hesitated before saying Hammond when she asked for his name, but he didn't show any identification to back up his claim. If this was really Professor Hammond, it would go against the official record of his death in 1965. However, because the Blackwood case is so strange, this difference seems almost appropriate. The County Historical Society got the key and note, and they stayed there until the society went out of business in 1968. No one knows where they are now. What is known is that not long after the man left, people in the area said they heard strange noises coming from the woods near the old estate. Some of these noises were described as mechanical grinding, stone moving against stone, and, most disturbingly, voices speaking in unison, though no words could be made out. These sounds lasted for about 3 weeks before stopping all of a sudden. During this time, the weather in the area around the former Blackwood property was strange. There was a perfectly round area of clear sky about a mile wide, while the rest of the area had normal winter weather. Meteorologists said that localized atmospheric conditions were to blame for this strange event, but they didn't say why. A group of speleologists looking into cave systems in western Pennsylvania found what looked like a man-made tunnel crossing a natural limestone formation about 12 miles from the Blackwood site in 1972. They went about 50 yards before hitting a collapse that stopped them from going any further. Before they turned around, they said they saw tool marks that didn't match up with how mining is done today and strange symbols carved into the rock face. Their next try to go back to the site with the right documentation tools was unsuccessful. Even though they used the same maps and GPS coordinates, they couldn't find the entrance to the tunnel again. People who go near the old Blackwood property today say that the silence there is strange. It's not the lack of sound, they say, but rather silence with presence and weight, as if something is always listening. The forest has taken back most of the evidence that people lived on the site, but the chambers that Robert Davenport and his colleagues found may still be there, housing whatever they found there in the fall of 1920, beneath the ground and out of reach of the seasons and weather. The most recent known event related to the Blackwood case happened in the spring of 1968, when a geology student from Pennsylvania State University found a strange rock while hiking near the old estate. The sample, which was about the size of a baseball, seemed to have fossilized organic material in it that couldn't be identified. The student put the specimen in a lab storage cabinet when they got back to campus, planning to look at it more closely the next day. Witnesses say that the next morning, the storage cabinet was open, and the things inside it were mostly untouched, except for the specimen, which had turned into a fine black powder. When looked at under a microscope, this powder showed strange properties. When the particles were separated, they seemed to move on their own, making short-lived patterns before breaking apart again. It was even more disturbing to find out that the powder had somehow etched those symbols into the metal surface of the cabinet shelf, even though it didn't have any acidic or corrosive properties. The university said it was either vandalism or a prank, and the case was officially closed. However, the student who found the specimen is said to have had worse and worse headaches and trouble sleeping in the weeks that followed, and they eventually dropped out of classes in the middle of the semester. No one knows where he is right now. And maybe the most disturbing thing is that Dr. Blackwood might have been right. Once some doors are opened, they can't really be closed again. Whatever went through that door in 1850, and maybe again in 1920, still exists in the spaces between regular matter, in the permeable boundaries of perceived reality, waiting, patient, not thinking in terms of years, but of centuries. There is one last document about the Blackwood estate in the dusty archives of Millbrooks Township records. A handwritten note that was added to the property deed when it was given to the public in 1937. The note, which had initials but no signature, said, "Let the forest reclaim this place. Let it be forgotten. What sleeps beneath should stay that way. Some secrets belong to the earth. There is no clear answer to the question of whether those secrets will stay buried. However, for the 3 men who came to Millbrook in September 1920 to clean up a 70-year-old abandoned house, the answer came at a terrible cost. They dug up something that should have stayed buried, and in doing so, they may have become part of the burial themselves." In 1976, the Harrisburg Public Library got an anonymous donation of books from the estate of a recently deceased resident. This was an interesting footnote to the story. There was a leather-bound notebook among these books that looked like Robert Davenport's personal journal from the time he spent in Millbrook and just before that. The library put this item in its catalog without realizing how important it was. It stayed that way until 1982, when a researcher looking into historical renovation techniques found it. The journal's first entries talked about Davenport's professional approach to restoration work and his first impressions of the Blackwood estate, which he called a fascinating example of mid-century construction with unusual architectural elements that merit preservation. But entries starting on the 17th of September 1920, the 3rd day of work at the property, have a very different tone. Davenport wrote, "I found something unexpected today while looking at the water damage in the main parlor. Notice that the floor timbers don't match the date the house was built. They're newer and were probably replaced in the late 1840s. When we took out a piece to see how bad the rot was, we found that the original floor had been cut away to make room for something below. This is not a normal cellar entrance. H thinks it might be a priest hole or smuggler's cache, but the design is all wrong for that." I'm reminded of Hammond's monograph on hidden architectural spaces, especially his theory about chambers of contemplation used by certain esoteric societies. Later entries describe how the team found the sealed brick entrance and decided to open it. At first, they were just curious about it professionally, but as time went on, Davenport said they felt an inexplicable compulsion to see what lies beyond. His writing shows signs of obsession, with multiple pages dedicated to detailed drawings of the symbols found on the bricks and speculations about their meaning. The last dated entry, from September 24th, has a passage that may best sum up the horror of what happened. H touched it today. God help him. He brushed his bare hand against the surface beneath the slab before we could stop him. The change was instantaneous, not physically, but in his eyes. Something looked out through them that wasn't him anymore, something old and patient and utterly alien. It spoke with his mouth, asking questions about our world, as if encountering it for the first time. "How do you perceive time?" it asked. "How do you maintain coherence?" When W tried to help him, H simply looked at him and said, "You next." We restrained him and brought him back to town, but I fear it's spreading. W hasn't spoken since the incident, and I feel something watching from behind my own thoughts, waiting for a moment of weakness. The barrier is failing. What Blackwood contained is emerging. I must warn, there is an abrupt end to the journal on a page dated September 25th. The Harrisburg Library said in 1985 that the journal was missing from its collection. Its disappearance was just as strange as its arrival. The researcher who found it was able to take pictures of several pages before it was lost, but these pictures show strange distortions and areas of blurriness that can't be explained, as if the contents were actively fighting against being documented. People who know about the Blackwood case often talk about how information comes and goes in a pattern, documents go missing, witnesses stop talking, and investigations are dropped. It seems like the story itself has an unstable reality, existing in a space between historical fact and folklore. In this way, the Blackwood incident may have left behind the most lasting legacy. Not what was found under that abandoned house, but what it says about the nature of reality itself. That there may be other forms of existence waiting and watching beneath the surface of our world, in the spaces we rarely notice. That what we think is solid and certain may be more permeable than we want to believe. And that some boundaries, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. The story of the three men who cleaned a 70-year-old abandoned house in 1920 and found what should have stayed buried is still not finished. It is like a puzzle with missing pieces that may be better left unassembled. Robert Davenport learned that curiosity can come at a high cost for those who dig too deeply into such mysteries. There are reasons why some doors are locked, and some secrets belong to the earth.